How does Oda do it? How does Oda make me this sad with so little? In just 3 pages, I have been devastated in the way that only a One Piece flashback can. And I think a lot of the reason it pulls that off is because of how deliberate the choices are on what to show and what not to show. Paneling and visual storytelling apply to a sequence like this as well, because every panel here has a purpose. Later, I will go back and talk about some of the action paneling from earlier in the chapter, because there's some cool stuff there too, but we had to start here, so let's get right into it. We start with this establishing shot, not just to tell us where it's all happening, but to set a mood. It's a bright sunny day, there's very few shadows, the sky has clouds but is overall clear, and then after that, we zoom into the specific happy mood of the characters. In this one panel, we immediately understand the overall situation, that these 2 parents are overjoyed at their child's birth. We don't need anything more, we don't need anything setting it up, this is enough. But the other clever thing going on here is that it's also clearly showing us the faces of the major characters, and even down here, we get Kuma's face. And this is important because for the rest of the flashback, we need to know who these people are, so the story makes sure to put that front and center and make it clear. Now there's some great syncing of the dialogue and visuals in this panel, because just as Kuma's father talks about his concerns and his worries with his bloodline, we also have a shot that shows his enormous build, that establishes the results of his bloodline that he's so worried about. But the panel that I find really interesting is the one after that, because one thing we could never do is go straight from the character's worries to those worries being realized. We need to have this panel in between. We need to have this panel to lull us into a false sense of security and a false sense of joy. We think that we're okay, we think that Kuma's happiness is secured. Only after that will the impact of something going wrong hit. Now what I like about these next panels is how well they use the idea of closure. I've talked about the idea of closure before, but in a very specific context. In a basic sense, closure is how the mind fills in events between 2 panels of comic. We start from someone standing up, and we gather that the motion occurred that they fell over. But there are different types of closure, and I'm not going to list them all now, partially because I don't remember them, but Scott McCloud's great book Understanding Comics goes into this. But essentially, closure can also be about larger events applied in between, about long periods of time. For instance, our brain is filling in that this character died because we go from a shot of them alive to a gravestone. Here, we're being given very, very limited slices of the events that happened, and this is being done so that our mind fills in what happened in between. It just fills in what's happening outside of these tight shots. Essentially, closure allows things to come more alive in our heads than they are on the page. The fact that we're wondering just how bad it was, who is running here, why is this doctor saying sorry, did he give them away? All of these implications are more powerful because they are just implications. But Oda normally doesn't do these kinds of long gaps of time between. But Oda normally doesn't use these kinds of long gaps of time between 2 panels, and so he makes sure to use his signature panel ellipses to tell us that a lot of time is passing between these events. But the one I find most interesting here is this final page because of the cliffhanger it implies. Kuma's father is begging for his wife and son to not be taken, and we see someone's arms in handcuffs, and you can probably look into how thick the arms are and figure out who it's supposed to be, but when you're reading through quickly, your brain is just taking it as a cliffhanger. Your brain is taking it as a question of whose body is here, who is in these handcuffs, and that question can then be resolved on the next page, though not before we establish the sheer emotion going on in Kuma's father. The panel of the family together enslaved is one of the most powerful ones in the chapter, and it's because of all the visual storytelling going on here. It's not just that Kuma's father is this injured, but it's the fact that he's leaning away from his family, that he has this much distance between him and them. What this is telling us is that Kuma's father is focused on the shame he feels for having failed to save them, for how his family are now enslaved with him, while Kuma and his mother have no distance between them and are leaning into each other, because what Kuma's mother is focused on right now is that the family is still together, that she still gets to be with her loved ones. And all of that is being achieved while at the same time we are still resolving that cliffhanger of whether or not they were taken into slavery. Now, this next row of panels is probably the best example in the chapter of how Oda is showing only what's necessary and nothing more. Sure, we could probably get a longer paneled full scene of Kuma having to carry heavy things for the Celestial Dragons, but what matters here isn't showing the full events. Each one of these panels is there to communicate one thing about what slavery is like for them. First, labor. Second, beatings. Third, suppression of emotions. And so each panel only needs to show that thing and nothing more. This third panel also has some very specific imagery that is going to come back later, but we'll get to that in a minute. Something that's been going on throughout this whole sequence that I haven't commented on much yet is the sense of contrast. Now, narrative contrast is a bigger topic than I really have time to get into here, both in how it matters to One Piece and in how it matters to storytelling in general. But the short version is you want to go back and forth between moods and concepts. If one thing happens second, you want the thing that happens first to be the opposite, so that the second thing hits harder and we see fully what it's different from. And what this scene is essentially doing, we start with happiness, then we go to slight worries, then we return to happiness in spite of those worries, then we go to everything going wrong. But then after that we get the joy of family being together in the same panel as the failure to save them, and then we go deep into the struggles of slavery and how difficult it is for Kuma. Each one of these beats hits harder because we got something different right before. But after this, as you probably remember, we have to go into Kuma's mom dying, and in order for that to hit, we need to have a brief moment of positivity. We have to have a brief moment where family is happy to see each other, where their togetherness helps make some of it okay, so that the death can then hit us all over again. That is the power of contrast. Now, I really like how this panel is such a distant shot, because it's essentially paralleling the idea that when someone first tells you a tragedy, you haven't fully processed it yet, because a distant shot takes the focus away from the characters and their feelings, and so it conveys that same idea that we're hearing the words, but we haven't let it sink in yet. But then, once again, with contrast, we have to let it sink in. We have to see the sheer sorrow on his father's face, and the fact that all of this is real, and we have to see the little cliffhanger of how tragic this is for Kuma. And then unfortunately, we have to get that cliffhanger resolved with the sheer sorrow that Kuma is feeling. I've talked a lot before about how size is emphasis on a manga page, and this is the largest panel we've gotten yet in this flashback, because how Kuma feels is more important than everything else. But once again, as we go into the next panels, we have to once again use contrast, and so we return to just a little bit of joy in order to set up the final tragedy. I think that this moment really hits, this moment really feels sudden, because of how Kuma's father's speech bubble leaks into this page. It makes it feel like he was literally interrupted mid-word when he was shot. But the final thing that I find so clever is the fact that this panel mirrors the panel we just had last page, where the Celestial Dragon is telling Kuma to be quiet while crying. This mirroring essentially shows us how casual this is to the Celestial Dragons. That is the extent of their cruelty and inhumanity. Having to shoot someone for singing and having to yell at someone for being too loud when crying are the same situation to them. It doesn't make any difference. What's also clever about this is how small the Celestial Dragon is. Not just because they are very, very small people, but because we're putting no focus on their faces or their emotions, because it's not a deep emotion for them. This really means nothing to them. It was purely out of convenience. And that contrast between how they feel and how horrible this is for Kuma is punctuated by not even getting to see it. Because again, some things are most powerful when we don't even see them. We could see another panel of Kuma sobbing, but it might feel a little repetitive when we just got this one. So instead the story makes us imagine it to make it hit harder. If Kuma felt this horrible when his mother died, how must he have felt when he lost the only other parent he had left? Oh boy, that was rough. I don't have anything else to say about that flashback sequence, so we are now going to come back into the action. Feel free to pause the video and take a moment before we talk about this now. There is one thing that I find so impressive about the paneling of Saturn's powers, and that's how well Oda has made a power that is literally invisible completely clear in a visual way. Look at this panel of Bonnie being hit by Saturn's powers. A character here and a character here doesn't have to be interpreted as this character flying backwards. It can just as well be this character moving forwards. So why do we know that Bonnie is flying backwards? Why is it so immediately obvious to our eyes? Well, the main reason for that is the line of action. The line of action is the concept that if a character is going in one direction, just have them lean in that direction. And not just if they're running. If they're sort of jumping through the air in that direction, make sure they're leaning in that direction. Don't have them jump feet first, basically. And what this means is that if a character is leaning back, then it conveys the feeling that they're going backwards. And this is what we see in both Bonnie and Sanji here. Their lines of action are backwards, and that's how we know that they are being knocked backwards. But the other thing that's so clever is that they are both perfectly aligned with the direction Saturn is looking in. And that is something that I found so easy to completely miss, but is so important to the visual clarity here. I've talked about eye lines before, and how when you see a character looking direction, your brain immediately knows how to follow that direction and see what they're looking at. And that concept is being used here to show us that however Saturn's power works, it uses line of sight. I think everybody who read this chapter immediately understand that he knocks people back by looking at them, and they didn't even think, why do we know that? Because it's so instinctive and visual that we immediately understand. And again, I can't believe Oda pulled that off with a power that's literally invisible. Now, what I really like about this second panel is that it's using the same concept that the character should move in the direction that our eye is moving in, but in a slightly different way. Because we start with Bonnie actually moving to the right, and then we go from that rightward movement into her being stopped. And in the sense of Galilean relativity, that is the same exact motion as when a character goes from being stopped to running to the left. It's just in a different frame of reference. And what this means is that because we know Bonnie is moving to the right here, we feel her stopping as we jump into this panel, in the same way that when we go from a character not moving, we feel them moving as we go into the panel, as our eye goes to the left. It's also very deliberate how large Saturn is being portrayed in each of these panels. I mean, sure, obviously, he's a huge character, but even in this panel, where it's a close-up behind him where we aren't even seeing his whole body, it's still deliberately framed in a way that makes him way larger than his opponent, because Saturn is the dominant fighter right now. Even his close-up panels are way larger than Sanji's because he has the power right now. Now, there's a lot going into the framing of this panel here, and that's because not just are the Straw Hats very small, but they are essentially boxed in. There are a lot of ways this panel could have been composed. We could have had a Marine here that's overlapping them, or we could have been from a less low angle. We could have been looking more from above, and the Marines all could have been running in like here, and that wouldn't fail entirely, but because we're at such a low angle, we essentially have Marines on the left, Marines on the right, and Saturn above. The Straw Hats are literally trapped. The framing conveys this, just as they are trapped from the front and from behind in world. I also love these two panels of Luffy and Kizaru because of how flat they are, because the way that neither of them is occupying the top half of their panels. Normally when you have a panel of a character, you want to have them positioned so their head isn't touching the ceiling, but they're filling it out pretty nicely. That makes a composition look good. And if you want to draw two characters lying down, you can just draw a panel that has them in the middle, but what the story does here is deliberately have them lying down in the bottom halves of the panel so we feel all of the space that they aren't filling. So we feel that if they were stronger right now, if they weren't so weakened, they would be filling their panels properly, and that just helps convey the sense of weakness. And of course, seeing Luffy on the ground here is also very important for understanding on a physical level what's about to happen here, that he's about to have an attack come down on him from above like this. The fact that Saturn is so tilted here helps make it feel like he's really looking down on Luffy, that he's looking down on whatever the next panel is. But the thing I love most about this is how physical it is, and to talk about that we have to go to the next page. This panel is a perfect example of what it is that I love about One Piece fights. They are physical in a way that is directly tied to the flow of the fight. What that means is that if you break the fight down into its beats, one thing happens, then the next thing happens, then the next things happen. In One Piece, those beats are the majority of the time going to be about where the character is. And a lot of other manga just don't write fights this way. I mean, they might have a physical component, in that two characters might, having their swords hit each other's swords. But even though there might be a physical component like that, they aren't having the physical situation change from panel to panel in that same way. Or we might just have a fight that has a ton of text delving into the strategy, and this can be interesting if you do it with some restraint, but the thing about both of these types of fights is that they aren't using the medium in the same way that a really physical fight does. When we read this One Piece fight, we understand something is coming down from Luffy. When we read this sequence in One Piece, we understand something is coming down on Luffy from above. Okay, Luffy is pushed out of the way by someone from behind, literally hitting him, while the attack from before hits the ground. But also, the way I've drawn this is really flat and boring. What Oda is great at is doing it in a really interesting shot where we have this stretching from the foreground and the background, with Luffy even further in the foreground, while Luffy is curved with the fist that just hit him. When you read this panel, every motion is so clear. Frankie punching through, Luffy flying this way, and Saturn's claw hitting straight down, all in one panel. That, in my opinion, is what good paneling is. And another example of good paneling is in the fact that we make sure to have a panel to show Frankie grabbing. Because when your fights are predominantly physical, You need to show the physical beats. We can't just have Franky grabbing Luffy and assume that that's clear enough. We need to establish that he went from punching forward with a fist to an open hand trying to grab in order for this to make sense. What I find really cool is that we go from Franky's hand being here all along with this motion to Luffy being here. And it's not just that the motion feels real, it's that he is pulling Luffy past Saturn. Just as he is in the physical world as Saturn is between them, he is also doing so on the manga page. We even have Saturn literally looking over at Luffy and Franky from panel to panel, which I always love to see Oda do. I also like these panels of Luffy and Bonnie, just because there's some interesting parallelism going on between them, as they are both being held in giant fists. But we have Luffy being bright, while Bonnie is darkly shaded in, and this is to convey that Luffy is in a much safer and better position than she is. They might be in a similar position physically, but Luffy is safe and Bonnie is in danger. We even see that same technique used over here because Vegapunk is shaded in while Saturn is bright. Again, the one who is shaded in is the one who's in a more difficult, darker position. Now, this shot of Bonnie is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting choices in the chapter, and it's not just because it's a relatively interesting shot from above as we see Saturn's arms stretching from above down below to him, and we see Bonnie in the middle. No, what's interesting about it is that we use this particular angle for a specific reason. Compare it to this panel down here. This panel is all about Saturn's speech. It's all about Saturn giving the reveal about the Buccaneer race. And so this panel takes focus away from Bonnie. The main thing we see is Saturn's fist. It's taking Bonnie's visual space. Bonnie doesn't really stand out. But this panel up here is mainly making the point of the pain that Bonnie is going through, the physical pain that is, and so it had to be from an angle that makes Bonnie stand out, and that's why it's from above, so we can see the darkness of Bonnie's clothes stand out against the brightness of the fist, so the fist can essentially form a small circle composition directing focus here. Another thing that I thought was cool was this line of conflict between the two sides in the fight, because normally when you have a line like this, it's going to be more horizontal. We'll have one character here and one character here, and we'll have this sort of visual line between them to convey that they're about to fight. Here, it's leaning back like this, it's so slanted, and that's to help convey that the characters are literally pushed down, because what's going on is the characters are physically incapable of getting up. And again, this is an invisible power. That is a really hard thing to draw visually, but Oda implies it by having this conflict line lean back so much that it feels like it's pressuring them. Now, the final panel I wanted to talk about today is this one of Bonnie, and that is because it is the perfect way to go into Kuma's flashback. Bonnie is completely de-emphasized here, in great contrast to how a lot of these other panels are putting the focus on her emotions, because this panel is more about how the Marines don't see her as a person, they don't care about her emotions. But we also have this interesting composition of guns being pointed at her from all angles that doesn't just make her seem like she's a sacrifice, but it makes it feel like it's the whole world against her. And that is a great note to transition into the backstory on, because that is the exact same place that Kuma was in. We don't just transition into the backstory by showing Bonnie close her eyes and think about things, we transition into it by having the situation she's in thematically match how Kuma felt throughout his life. And I think I'm going to leave it on that note for now, but I hope you enjoyed this analysis. There's a lot that I didn't get a chance to talk about, so if you want to talk about more of the paneling from this chapter, feel free to leave a comment. If you want to see more of my videos when they come out, subscribe, and if you just care about helping me grow larger on YouTube, then you might as well give it a like. And if for some reason you still feel a need to be on Twitter like I do, then go follow me for updates on how I make these videos and hopefully other interesting takes on One Piece.